As remarkable and laudable as you know very well as this expansion has been, it has also witnessed a multitude of challenges. So this multitude of challenges currently the sector faces, leadership and management is one of them. So this is particularly worrying because the sector is currently expanding even more, and the need for skilled and competent leadership and management becomes very imperative. So managing a plethora of stakeholders, students, parents, academics, staff, management, unions, when I say unions, staff unions, student unions, institutions, ministries, businesses, etc., industry, with many interests, albeit sometimes competing, makes the task of leadership considerably demanding and increasingly arduous. To be sure, even in the best of times, leading higher education institutions in Africa, for that matter, anywhere in the world, is not easy. It is not an easy task. Managing institutions where resources are chronically short, enrollments are ballooning, infrastructure and facilities are deficient, staff and are financially distressed and discontent, has become a tremendous burden. The incalculable impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on this already overburdened sector is yet to be fully established. We are well aware that leadership in academic institutions, even in advanced countries, has become increasingly taxing and demanding. So, pressured by relentless demands for accountability and transparency, dogged by serious legal, financial, and administrative issues, attacked often these days for lack of integrity and at times egregious fraud, confronted by outdated notion of ivory tower, occasionally a subject of bad praise, managing and leading higher education institutions has become, as I said earlier, daunting. And COVID-19 has thrown another huge and unprecedented challenge to an already massively onerous task. According to organizational theorists who study higher education as an organizational body, they describe the leadership phenomenon as organized anarchy, as these experts hold that higher education as an organization is unique because it has ill-defined and confounding objectives, competing interests, ambiguous processes, elusive outcomes, and ever-changing boundaries. The unprecedented calamities of COVID-19 throws yet another spanner into the works. So the objective of this webinar is to create just one opportunity for executive and senior institutional leaders and managers, as well as policymakers, to discuss their experiences and share sound practices, and in the process benefit from different perspectives to help manage their institutions in the aftermath of COVID-19. With that background, I'm delighted to introduce Professor Afur Kasu for key opening message for this webinar, which brought together quite a distinguished speakers. Professor Afur Kasu is the State Minister of Science and Higher Education of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia. He leads the science, linkage, and higher education research and community services of the ministry. Before joining the Ministry of Science and Higher Education, he served as a State Minister of Foreign Affairs. And also before that, a State Minister for Science and Technology before coming a Foreign State Minister. More relevant to our team here, he served as a Vice President for Research and Community Services at one of the oldest universities in Ethiopia, University of Gondar. Professionally, Professor Afur was trained as a biologist and applied microbiologist at Ethiopia's flagship institution, Addis Ababa University, and earned BSc and Masters. But he went on to do his PhD in biomedical sciences from the University of Tokushima, Japan. I will leave the rest, simply drop this by saying he has published over 140 peer-reviewed journals, articles, book chapters, and so forth. So I am particularly delighted to invite His Excellency Professor Afur Kasu, the State Minister of Science and Higher Education, a ministry which I am honored to serve as a chair of its distinguished advisory council. Professor Afwerk, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that very generous introduction, Professor Damto. Your Excellency, guest of honor of this webinar, Professor Damto Tafarra, coordinator of CESA Higher Education Cluster at University of KwaZulu-Natal, South Africa, distinguished speakers of this webinar, respected participants of this very important and timely webinar, distinguished CESA Higher Education Cluster expert team members, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all from Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. On behalf of the Federal Democratic Republic of Ethiopia, Ministry of Science and Higher Education, I would like to thank my longtime friend and brother, Professor Damto Tafarra, for inviting me to address participants of this very timely webinar entitled University Leadership and Management in the Era of COVID-19. Ladies and gentlemen, with support of eminent African and global scientists like Professor Damto, Professor Bezu, and many others I see in this panel, Africa tried its best to address issues of higher education, leadership, and management in COVID when we were hit hardest last year and up until now. As you all know, the global pandemic of COVID-19 has put our global humanity into huge stress and has been costing us unprecedented loss of life from all walks of life, from every corner of the world. The global, continental, and country-specific damage from COVID-19 is huge in terms of its social, where we are discussing the higher education, economic, political, cultural, psychological, environmental, and other impacts. The global data, if we have searched today, the Worldometer, as of today, it shows over 182 million cases of COVID-19 and over 3.9 million deaths from COVID-19. In our continent, Africa, the figures are alarming and growing. The fear from the continuously increasing infection rate is disrupting our normal life routines, especially the fear from the newly emerging Delta strain of COVID-19 is a huge threat to all of us, not only for us in Africa, but also to the global community, the Delta strain. Ladies and gentlemen, when the pandemic hit the world last year, it had forced all of us to close our schools, our colleges, and the universities. Since the last quarter of 2020, countries in Africa, including my country, Ethiopia, put in place strategies and reopened universities. Although running the routine activities has been not easy while controlling the transmission of the virus, the strategies put by our higher education leaders in place to compensate for the lost classes helped to conduct teaching and learning and managing university activities to somehow to the level we have reached at now. For example, in my country, Ethiopia, we have 52 public and 278 private higher education institutions with over 2 million students in the system. Resuming face-to-face classes and practical sessions have been not so easy under COVID-19 for us. We are forced to reduce class size by about 50% to abide to the COVID-19 prevention protocols on social distancing. This caused additional burden on instructors and university management in terms of using evening class hours and weekends to compensate for the lost time, for the time wasted due to social distancing and reducing the number of students per class. Using technology and introducing online classes have not also been as easy as we thought due to the meager infrastructure and weak internet connectivity. The same holds true for university leadership, management, and governance activities, which are equally affected, if not more. On the other hand, now we can imagine how the COVID-19 pandemic revolutionized the future of teaching and learning globally in general and in Africa in particular. Therefore, higher education institutions in Africa should be very ready to respond to the new revolution on teaching, learning, research, and the whole system of higher education administration. Our higher education system should also invest on the information communication technology infrastructure and virtual learning platforms. With the current economic recession and travel restrictions due to COVID-19, we will not expect that our higher education faculty will get long-term and short-term scholarships in the West as before. Our higher education institutions cannot sit down and wait until economies rise and borders open. We need to adapt ourselves towards virtual learning opportunities and support our students and faculty to improve their digital literacy and benefit from virtual learning. In this regards, ministries of higher education in African countries shall exert their utmost efforts to respond to this challenge together with higher education leaders, with the academic community and development partners. Global bodies like UNESCO, continental bodies like the African Union Commission, the African CDC, regional bodies like SADC, NEPAD, etc., shall also help African higher education system during these very challenging times. Taking this opportunity, ladies and gentlemen, I would like to reconfirm my government's, my ministry's interest and commitment to strengthen collaboration on higher education leadership and management in Africa and beyond with all countries around the world while fighting COVID-19 and even post-COVID-19. Finally, I would like to reiterate that the continental approach to higher education, as my colleague Professor Damto now and again stresses, is extremely important, and we all shall stand in support of the African Union Commission and it is CESA 2024, and it is CESA, Science, Technology and Innovation Strategy for Africa, CESA 2025, both of which are essential in strengthening collaboration in Africa as part of the aspirations of our Africa's Agenda 2063, and also in making cooperation among our institutions of higher learning very effective. We look forward to work with you all in the years to come, and I wish you, my colleagues, very fruitful discussions in this very timely webinar of today. Thank you again for the opportunity given to me. Back to you, Professor.
Thank you very much indeed, Prof. Afwerk, for that excellent perspective and key messages, and also really articulating the complex challenges universities and governments and other entities have confronted in the aftermath of COVID-19. I don't like to summarize this wonderful speech, just to simply, however, highlight the key statement here. We cannot sit and wait. I can even say idle until borders are open. I love that. Yes, we got to do what we got to do in terms of how to build our knowledge sector. This is higher education institutions. And also I like the idea that you emphasize the need to deploying a multitude of stakeholders to address this issue. Thank you tremendously, Prof. Howard. Greatly appreciate that. Now moving to the next part of our session, we have already discussed with the speakers here that there will be three lead questions that these distinguished speakers would be talking around. So these are the following. I will spell them out for the purpose of the audience. So the first one is, what were the key challenges of COVID-19 you faced as leaders or in whatever position you find yourself in terms of teaching and learning, research and community service, and management and admin? So that was the first question. And then the second question is, how did you as leaders went about confronting it or overcoming them? So these are the three questions, the two questions. The last question, which I will come back to, will be then we'll go around that once we deal with the first two questions. So let's start with the perspective from East Africa and by Professor Mike Kuria. Mike is a Deputy Executive Secretary of the Inter-University Council for East Africa in Uganda, Kampala. Before joining IUCEA, he served as the Director for the Center for Quality Assurance at Daystar University in Nairobi. He's been involved in regional quality assurance at regional level and was part of the teams that developed the East African Community Regional Quality Assurance Framework that led to the declaration of the East African Community as a common higher education area in 2017. He holds a PhD in literature from the University of Leeds and has a special interest on gender politics and representation in creative writing. Mike, you got 7 minutes for the two questions. I'll give you a warning when you reach the 6 minutes. The floor is yours, Mike.
Thank you very much, Dantu. I will go straight to the question that you have asked, but before I do that, do allow me to say one or two things about the Inter-University Council for East Africa. We are a 50-year-old institution of the East African community comprising 6 partner states. This is Burundi, Kenya, South Sudan, Rwanda, Uganda, and United Republic of Tanzania. We are one of 8 institutions of the EAC charged with different responsibilities, and ours is to coordinate higher education and advise partner states on the same. We celebrated 50 years in the middle of the pandemic in November 2020, and I'm glad to let you know that we have currently over 300 universities in the region. 132 of those are our members, and so some of the things that I'm going to be saying are experiences that are drawn from our member universities. The 300 universities are not all members, but we still cover them in our activities. And so I'll be talking about our experience dealing with those. You asked the question, what were the key challenges of COVID-19? And because of the time limitations, I'll just list them almost one by one by drawing your attention to the things that happened around. Of course, the first one was the question of facing the unknown. As soon as COVID hit in the region, universities were closed indefinitely. And of course, for a bit of time, people kept thinking it's going to change. Announcements are going to be made on the way forward. And it was a question of a wait and see. So that was the first challenge. What do you do in the meantime when you don't know whether the universities will open tomorrow or the day after or for a long time? Number 2, of course, was the question of disruption. Face-to-face learning was stopped. Teaching and learning got disrupted, sometimes in the middle of the term or even in the middle of exams. Students were asked to leave the compounds of the universities. And in some cases, students who had gone out could not come back because movement was stopped. And so that, of course, became a very difficult thing for the universities to deal with. Number 3, I would say there was a question of communication, contact for the students. So once students have gone out and universities have not developed the practice of keeping students contact so that you are able to tell them that the universities have closed down, but we are changing to online teaching and learning, and you can access your classes here and there. So that, I think, was also another challenge for universities, realizing that they are not able to contact their students. Number 4, I would say the question of resources, resistance, and even capacity for staff and students. Here I'm referring to the fact that staff and students, some of them, did not have the capacity to access online teaching and learning, sometimes because of technical know-how, and sometimes because they don't have the necessary equipment, or sometimes that they don't have the data to be able to move online. So that, I think, was another challenge that many universities in the region faced. And the 5th thing I would say was the question of ICT infrastructures. They were hardly developed in some of the cases, in some of the universities, maybe very few universities. And let me say that in the course of the time, I'll be sharing some preliminary results of a survey that we are doing in the region to see the impact of COVID-19. But one of the things that we are noticing is that universities are saying that when that happened, they did not have the ICT infrastructure to enable them to move online. Number 6, I would say there was the challenge of funding to establish the ICT infrastructures or to develop materials for online teaching and learning. I think someone just mentioned at the beginning of this webinar that the question of funds is a critical one. Sometimes they are dwindling. And so this comes at a time when universities are not prepared to do that. And so to find funds to make sure that you develop that particular system also became quite a bit of a challenge. So just to let you know that as part of the research that we are doing, similar things are coming out from the universities. And the most one that seems to be really critical to the universities in terms of a challenge is on the question of students lacking skills, internet connectivity, and equipment to transition to e-learning. So far, that seems to have been the greatest challenge. But there are also others who are saying they did not have an online and distance learning policy in place. They did not have online resources accredited by the regulator. So immediately start you asking yourself questions, how do we proceed from here when our resources are not accredited by the regulator? What we'll do, will it be accepted by the regulators? And they didn't have any immediate guidance at that particular time. Some did not even have an e-learning platform in place at all. Financial resources, of course, I have just mentioned, technical knowledge, and of course, the students. So those are some of the issues that are coming out from the universities. Now, let me go to the second question. How did leaders go about overcoming some of these challenges that I have just raised? I want to, first of all, let you know what we did at IUC ourselves. We were also affected, I must say. But luckily, number 1, we had already subscribed to Zoom and we were already using it for our meetings in cases where staffs were out of office. And so we did not find it very difficult to move online to do our meetings, to do our statutory meetings. That we found quite easy to do for us. Number 2 is that we also realized that our staff members in different universities have got difficulties in terms of being able to operate on the digital environment for teaching and learning. And therefore, we created a Moodle platform for member universities. And on this platform, we invited those people who wanted to learn how to teach online to come and learn. And that course was offered. And I believe about 60 staff academics from different universities participated. The number could be a little bit higher. We also moved to try and monitor what was happening to some of our students. We're monitoring that online. We have 2 projects that are going on right now, and our students were scattered across the Southern and Eastern African region. The first program was what we call the EAC Scholarship Program, funded by the German Development Bank. And we had about 56 students in different universities. And of course, they too were disrupted. And then we had another about 60 students also under the African Centers of Excellence. They were also studying in different places and they also were disrupted. But we tried to monitor them by using online means.
Got 1 minute.
1 minute? Ladies and gentlemen, so that's how IUCA we reacted. Let me just take you straight to the reaction by universities. I'm going to classify that into three because of time. The first type of universities that just became frightened and ran away. So I'm calling that fright and flight. So those one just sent students home. Number two, we had those universities that got frightened, but they fought back. So they immediately put emergency mitigation measures in place to try and make sure that some form of learning continues. So they went on Zoom, they tried Google platform and things like that. And number three, I would say, there are those who got frightened, they fought back, but they also started planning. And they put some measures in place to make sure that all, teaching and learning continues. Let me just highlight them very quickly because of time. One is that they went online, adopted existing infrastructure, and started some form of online teaching and learning. That could have been on Google, on Zoom, Teams, and things like that. Others also started to build ICT infrastructures. They have scaled that immediately. They started holding capacity building workshops for staff members in place to enable them to operate on the environment. They tried to empower their students by provision of data in comparison with companies, say for Safaricom in Kenya, for example. They got into partnership and provided data bundles and sometimes equipment. Some also began to develop policies to regulate teaching and learning on this kind of platform. Some scaled down on staff and increased the workload for some so that they could reduce on cost. And some negotiated with service providers for data, and in some cases, also devices. I think I'll leave it there for now. I believe I may have used my 7 minutes. Thank you.
Yes, you have indeed used your minutes. Thank you very much for that presentation. You would have a chance to elaborate during the Q&A session. I will also throw some things in there. The second presentation is a perspective from research universities. And of course, Prof. Ernest Ariete is the Secretary General of the African Research Universities, what we call ARUA. It's a network of 16 African flagship universities, and is a professor of economics and the former vice chancellor of the flagship university of the country, University of Ghana. He was previously director of Institute for Statistical, Social, and Economic Research at University of Ghana, and the first director of the Africa Growth Initiative of the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. He has held academic appointments at the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, Yale, Swarthmore in the US, and more. He has a long CV. I would just simply to say that when I say a vice chancellor, other portfolios below that are not particularly relevant. I'll just leave it as that. I'll give the floor to Ernest. Prof. Ayete, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much, Damtu. Thank you for inviting me to this forum. And I do hope that what I share with you will help us to understand better how African universities have coped with the pandemic. I agree entirely with everything that my colleague Mike has said about the East African universities. I agree. What I want to do with the time available to me is to show how the ARUA universities responded. So I give more illustration of how this was done. And so by building on what Mike has shared with us. I agree that when the pandemic first broke, many universities were not sure of how to respond. They were not sure whether it was going to be a short-term thing or was going to really grow into something very, very big. Remember when the pandemic first broke, we heard about it in China, and then later on it moved into Europe, and then slowly worked its way into Africa. Nobody knew how big it was going to be in Africa. There were those who thought it was going to be really, really big, much bigger than in China or in Europe, and those who were a lot more restrained. So our universities were not left behind in that kind of discourse. Was it going to be big? So the real thing that shook the region was the uncertainty. How do you deal with uncertainty? And you know, in leadership, management of institutions, how to deal with uncertainty is really one of the biggest things that any leader will have to contend with. So in dealing with that uncertainty, there are those universities that took the lead and asked their students to go home even before national governments did, even before national governments decided to close down public institutions. And I give you the example of the University of Ghana. The university, soon after one student had tested positive, decided to close shop. Later on, the national government came up and said, yes, let's close all public universities. I see a similar thing happening in other places. I see a situation where in Nigeria, for example, the government came and said, yes, let's close down, and then we closed down. In many South Africa and other places, the same thing. So leadership in managing uncertainty is very, very crucial in this kind of situation. As the students went home, there was no clear indication of when they'll be coming back. Were they going to be away for a short period and then come back, or they're going to be away for a long time? Most universities in the region took the position that regardless of whether they came back within a few weeks or a few months or a year, it was important that university activity went on. The only way to let it go on was to use new technologies. There were those universities that had, before the pandemic, as a result of rapid growth, embarked on distance education as the future of their strategic plans. So many of them were beginning to invest in distance education, and they were beginning to build the infrastructure for that. And that infrastructure that they were beginning to build became fortuitously appropriate for many of the things required for online delivery, online teaching and learning in the times of the pandemic. So our experience has been that the universities that were preparing for distance education were also the that were most prepared for doing online delivery of teaching and learning. They had to adjust. They had to adjust, and they were able to adjust a lot more quickly than other universities that were. And these were also the largest universities. So the larger universities responded much more quickly than the smaller ones that had not been privy to investing in distance education. So I give the examples of South African universities. I give examples of Ghana. I give examples of Nigeria, Makerere, Nairobi, and others. What is interesting, and so as the students left, and then they were forced to use online arrangements to keep teaching and learning going. A university like Cape Town realized that many of the poorer students couldn't afford what was required to be able to access online delivery. They didn't have laptops. So the university went into the business of arranging for laptops to deliver to poorer students. That was an example. Mike mentioned arrangements with the telecom firms and so on. There were countries like in Ghana where the students couldn't afford the data. So the universities went into arrangements with telcos to have subsidized data be made available to students. We find examples of that in Nigeria, we find examples in Tanzania and many other places. The platforms that were being used were in some cases adequate, in other places not so adequate. We have examples of Wits University in South Africa, University of Ghana, using the Sakai platforms. They had to work with the service deliverers to modify these to suit large numbers of students. In their earlier arrangements with the companies, they had envisaged only a few thousand students. Now they're doing many thousands of students. So they had to modify that. In modifying it, they also not only modified it for the students, also modified it for staff. Many of the staff in this university, I give the example of the University of Ghana. Many of them had not become well-trained, well-knowledgeable about the use of Sakai. They had to be trained, and Mike mentioned that they had to be trained in how to use Sakai to deliver lectures to students who were far away from you. And the students had to be trained in how to receive the material, and how to use the system. Lecturers had to be taught how to use the system to examine students. You know, one that they had not envisaged several months before the pandemic. Now they had to. So in many universities, finding the platform to use became the challenge, and using it properly, preparing students and the staff to use it became a bigger challenge. But that was solved in many as a result of collaboration. The area of research, that's where the biggest challenge came. The ability to go to the field and collect data was compromised. Even when they had the resources to do field work, they couldn't go to the field work because nations were in lockdown. And in many places where, as a result of the lockdown, people could not move from their homes to laboratories. So research slowed down considerably. But beyond the slowdown coming from inability to move from place to place, there was the problem associated with funding. So many of these research activities taking place required ongoing funding. But the people who funded research were struggling with their own national budgets, and so could not sustain funding for a long period. In Arua, we've seen how support from UKRI, for example, has gone down considerably as a result of funding for research. We do have support from Open Society Foundation, we do have support from Carnegie Corporation. Luckily, these have been maintained at the same levels, but support from UKRI directly facilitating research in our universities has gone down considerably. There are many other funders that have slowed down as a result of the situation. One interesting development has been that national governments are being drawn more and more into supporting research. And why is that? One interesting thing that came out of this pandemic is the fact almost every African government turned to its universities to find answers to the questions that were being posed. They were looking at the universities for answers to questions about vaccines. They were looking to them for answers about how to test. They were looking for answers on how to manage the pandemic. They realized that the university don't necessarily have the resources, and many then started supporting. Yeah, thank you. One minute to go. Thank you. So in many countries, whether in Ghana or in Nigeria, in Uganda, we've seen the government begin to invest in vaccine research. Going forward, what African governments need to do is support collaboration among universities, support collaboration in such a manner that the university will be able to work with one another. Arua is doing that. With our vaccine research hubs, we are able to support vaccine research in about 9 different universities at the same time. A lot of the genome sequencing work that is being done in the region is being done by Arua universities. So collaboration is the way forward. As a result of the pandemic, we've seen more and more collaboration between South African universities and other African universities. Can we use this to chart the way forward? Can we use this to bridge the gaps that have existed between these universities? In my view, that's the best way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ernest. Appreciate that. Our perspective from public higher education would have come from Professor Christine Ranzoa. I haven't seen her yet. So
what I'm here.
Oh, fantastic. Hi, Christine, welcome. I know that you have struggled to, yes. Now that I'm sure you've received the communication, so you got 7 minutes for the third, for the 2 questions, which you'll be dealing with. But before that, let me introduce to you Professor Christine Ranzoa. She is a professor of wildlife management. Even more so, she's a founder, vice chancellor of Muni University, Uganda. She is the current chairperson of actually the Inter-University Council for East Africa. She was the first female deputy director of School of Graduate Studies at Makerere University, and also a founder and also headed the Department of Wildlife Animal Resources Management. I'm cutting much of the impressive resume here in the interest of time, but I'm not going to leave out. She served as a chairperson of FAWE, the Forum for African Women Educationalists, and more so, she is a distinguished recipient of the 2018 National Golden Jubilee Award she received from President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. Welcome, Christine. You have 7 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. I appreciate the opportunity given to me to share the experience within this turbulent period. And I'm happy to see all the familiar faces and meet new ones. All of you are familiar with the leadership structures of higher education and especially universities. In Uganda, we have very structured system with council, senate, management, student bodies. And all these must play their role. Council, of course, is a paramount entity that approves policies and guidelines on how we administer universities. Colleagues, the challenges brought about by COVID-19 is very, I would say, what colleagues have shared is what we have gone through. But the major thing that happened in our country is the closure of institutions, which first happened in March 2020. And we are very hopeful that will revert to our activities. That did not happen for a couple of months. We had a dilemma on how to proceed. Although we've been using blended learning, this was not entrenched within policy framework. And therefore, the first take here was to say, okay, how can our activities be supported by policy and guidelines? And so we swung into development of ICT policies, policies on ODEL, e-learning, e-governance in the universities, and our councils had to approve this to mandate how we move forward. What implicitly that means is the teaching and learning has to, we had to shift from physical interactions. And you know, teaching and learning is a social issue, it's a social process. And it is very, very important for some disciplines to have social interaction like health. You can't do it all online. You can't do teaching practice online for education students. So we had to stay some of the programs and we swung onto online teaching and learning. The semester load couldn't be accomplished in time. And so 1 year, most universities lost a full year due to those processes. In areas of, and that means there's increased workload for both students and staff going forward. All those statements made by my colleagues, lack of internet bandwidth, and ICT infrastructure is a real problem for both students and staff. When you overcome the challenge of bandwidth, you then have to brace yourself to overcome the challenge of power for teaching online so that staff are able to upload. Student projects, which are for group members, also was affected. Now, in terms of research, it is a common thing. Research and community outreach often is a physical undertaking. Most of this could not happen except for questionnaire-based researches. But I must add that, you know, the upside of research here on the COVID is we have been able to establish collaboration. And I think that is what we can pick from the fight with the, you know, internal in-country universities as well as external universities to do what we can do online. The challenges which we experience with communities is that the expectations are very high in from what the university can do. They want universities to go beyond what they can offer, recognizing that, you know, we have funding gaps. In my country, almost all activities have been reduced because much of the financing now in government is redirected. We are also having psychosocial challenges on handling both staff and students. Staff and students have lost their loved ones. We have to build support systems to help both students and staff. Right now, we are in COVID-2 wave, which is so severe, very severe, that staff have been affected in a manner which cannot be described in human terms. So all these need overcoming. Nevertheless, I think we have cooperated with each other. We have very strong support from our government. We have very strong support from the governance system. They are also adopting online meetings, which makes it fairly easy to tackle. But every day they are emerging issues as a result of COVID. The staff are now saying universities should give them health insurance. That becomes a policy issue, but the funding is not there. Now, when you lose a staff or a student at work, colleagues, what do you do? These are real challenges. I guess I'm over with my time. I better stop here.
Yes, just you still have 1 minute if you wish. If you can dwell on what have you actually done to actually overcome some of these issues. In 1 minute.
Well, Prof, we have been able to develop policies which put guidelines together. We have set committees, COVID committees at every level. We have a team that handles the COVID cases. We have done tests on all those who have been, you know, allowed to stay on ground. And let me assure you, some of them turned positive, unfortunately. Now we have a framework on how to handle such cases with compassion, with support from the meager resources, so that they recover. And I'm happy to inform you they are recovering. The students and staff are being mentored online, and most of the courses that can be run online are being developed and uploaded. That is where I can.
Great, thank you so much. Appreciate that. That's a perspective from public higher education. Thank you once again. The next one is we are going to hear perspective from private higher education. And the professor, Associate Professor Wenderson Tamrath, is speaking around these issues. He's a president of St. Mary's University in Ethiopia, one of the major private universities in Ethiopia. He coordinates the subcluster for private higher education, the CESA, the higher education cluster. He's collaborating scholar of the program for research on private higher education at the State University of New York at Albany in the United States. He's the vice president of the Association of Private Higher Education Institutions in Ethiopia. And he has authored 2 books and numerous articles, book chapters, and policy papers on higher education, most notably on private higher education. Wenderson, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Damto, for offering me this opportunity and for offering actually the private higher education sector to share our experiences and perspectives. So essentially, African higher education is a public dominated sphere, but even within that sphere, we have a very fast growing segment of higher education, which is private higher education, which now, as most of you might possibly know, covers around 18 to 20% of enrollment at the African level. As my colleagues have clearly pointed out, the pandemic has spared no segment of higher education from being severely affected, but as most of you would possibly understand in your own countries, there appears to be the private higher education sector, which is currently experiencing a higher fatality rate of COVID-19 as compared to the public sector. I think in terms of the specific impacts and key challenges, I would very briefly talk about the financial losses, which are very, very critical to the sector, the teaching learning challenges, and the leadership challenges, as pointed out in the questions. As regards the overall impact on the sector, one can talk of closure, one can talk of risk of closure, cuts and budgets adjustments, losses, and in general, financial insolvency, which have become quite typical examples of what's happening within the private higher education sector. This is happening, as you might again understand, in the context of no government support, where private higher education institutions are heavily dependent on student tuition and fees, and where, despite the fact that they may have certain opportunities of making money, but at the time when the COVID-19 is exposing everybody to their weaknesses, private higher education institutions have been forced to lose their selling points, and as a result, they had to be definitely exposed to the different kinds of negative impacts. And this has been continental, you might say. If you look at Ghana, for instance, you would understand that most Ghanaian private higher education institutions were unable to pay salaries because of around 50% of fees which were not paid by students. You have Uganda, where 45 private universities were struggling to cope in the crisis. I don't know how far they have gone out of that crisis. They were again unable to pay salaries, had to lay off their staff, and had difficulties in terms of surviving the impacts of the COVID-19. Ethiopia is another example where almost 97% of institutions had no other income than student tuition fees, and paying rent salary was extremely difficult. Some institutions had to reduce the salary of their staff like by 50% or 65%. You have again Rwanda, where 58% of higher education students are in private higher education students, but a very recent publication as back as last week indicated that 10,000 students could not return to their respective campus, which means 20% of total students in the private higher education sector. So they were not able, even those who returned were not able to pay school fees, and many institutions are demanding for bank loans. We are trying to leverage with the government for this. The teaching and learning challenges have already been indicated. What's common for the public sector is quite common with the private sector, if it's not more serious. we have also faced the common challenges of internet connectivity, data costs, the lack of appropriate technology, but specific to private higher education institutions, preparing online platforms like learning management systems, creating the organizational structure, allocating the required budget, and having the right people with the technical expertise was additional difficulty because of the resource limitations that I told you about. These have definitely brought significant management and administration challenges. And one of the critical challenges for private higher education institution leaders was addressing the financial demands of their institutions, unlike the public sectors. There were actually other issues like being unsure of the fate of institutions, fear of losing experienced staff, declining work ethics and failure, the difficulties of convincing students to pay and faculty to share the financial strains that these institutions were undergoing, and the reopening preparations that private higher education institutions had to make as related to the new opening of schools and universities, and the feeling of uncertainty, which still happens to be there, which I can explain later. These have been the major challenges that institutions have been facing. In terms of the actual reactions, in terms of the actual activities that leadership was engaged in, I would say there were three major areas. One is the information provision function, which has not been previously mentioned. The other one is the task of providing online education and academic support. And the last one was ensuring institutional continuity, which was a critical problem with the private higher education sector. I think information provision about the pandemic was left on the institutions themselves, and leaders had to engage in many, many types of activities, like choosing the best institutional communication channels, selecting the information to be communicated, checking its authenticity, which was a critical element, providing translations in local languages, which had to happen in some cases, and making the information available on electronic platforms chosen, which were not in most cases available for most institutions, which had to use Facebook, Telegram, YouTube channels, MS messages for lack of their own learning management systems, which they have to develop later on. I think some of the important lessons drawn included the need for brevity during communication, authenticity, using simple language when communicating information, and the need for translation into local languages, which we have learned a lot about in terms of communicating the impacts and the things that the students had to do. Online education and academic support was another critical element of the engagement that leadership had to go into this. And I think, as my colleagues have suggested, arranging the right platforms, making the content choices, giving assignments and assessments, and coordination and follow-up and checking on student feedback have been serious challenges. As regard to the last issue of institutional continuity, I think leaders were also engaged in addressing institutional continuity despite the challenges. They had to stick to other elements, other functions that they had to do in order to ensure that institutions keep existing despite all the challenges that they were facing. And I think this included talking to governments for additional supports and for additional understanding. This has been more or less what has been happening within the private higher education sector across the continent, and specifically in Ethiopia, where I have much knowledge about the private higher education sector. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Wendersen, for that perspective on private higher education institutions, which seem to have a serious problem more than the public institutions. Yes, now we will have perspective from South Africa, where I am based, but I cannot think of a better person than Professor Ahmed Bawa, who is the CEO of the University of South Africa. Until recently, I don't know what recent means, he, at least several years ago now, he was Vice Chancellor and Principal of the Durban University of Technology. He has an interest in the understanding of universities as social institutions and the relationship between science and society. He is a theoretical physicist by profession. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Dabtu, and good afternoon, colleagues. And I trust that you're all well and safe. You know, as you would know, South Africa is now in the midst of the third wave, and we are all really in feeling very kind of compromised and challenged. Thank you so much for this invitation, and it's a real pleasure to be a part of this very substantive discussion. And thank you, Damtu, for inviting me. Yeah, you know, I think that there are three major issues that cover all the aspects that we've been dealing with for the last 18 months or so. The first is just clearly the issue of the uncertainty, you know, that COVID-19 introduced, and that uncertainty has really been devastating. And just in case you didn't know, our universities are going back into closure, in fact, on Wednesday, tomorrow. So we're frantically now trying to understand, you know, how to manage this next period of time. The second is the issue around complexity. Just the universities have so many moving parts, you know, the kind of the universities themselves within their own communities, the tensions and the relationships between teaching and learning, research, and so on. And then all the moving parts outside the university, which impact on the university, and all of that has been really elevated here during this period of time. And then the issue of sustainability. I mean, I think that we've heard from the other colleagues as well that the issue of sustainability has become a really big challenge, and it's something that we have to really spend the next 3 or 4 years, I think, getting our ducks in a row again. So clearly, in terms of teaching and learning, our primary purpose during the last 18 months was to try to understand how to complete the 2020 academic year. I'm pleased to say that all 26 universities did complete the 2020 academic year. Some of them only in April this year, and I think that that depended very heavily on the fact that all 26 universities were actually experimenting with forms of blended learning, sort of online learning, and so on. So there was a very rapid shift to new forms, or to these multiple pathways, if you like, to completing the academic year. Having said that, the moment we began to do that at all 26 universities, there were two things that really reared their head. The first is just a massive inequality between the institutions in our system. And you know, some were like sailing away, others were not, you know. And clearly the second one was just the inequality of access that students had. And this, of course, was a critical issue. So what I would like to just say at this point is that there were 3 steps that were taken that we think were critical in helping us to manage last year. The first one was the development of partnerships. I mean, our universities collaborated with each other in a way that had never been done before. And that was absolutely critical. So, you know, almost all the steps that the universities took, we came together, and we kind of, and USAF became, University of South Africa became the hub for that, to kind of galvanize a sectoral approach to it. Now, that doesn't mean, of course, that all the universities chose the same route, because you really can't compare, you know, the University of Cape Town with the University of Zululand. They're just very different kinds of institutions. So the question was, you know, how do we develop a sectoral approach to this? And so then, of course, partnerships between the universities and government, between universities and the private sector. So USAF also played a central role in trying to understand how to negotiate the best deals for data and so on. And that became very critical in the end. And the third point that I have to mention is that all 26 universities committed themselves to a social justice approach. And generally, the slogan we adopted was that no student would be left behind, that we would ensure that every student had the opportunity of completing the academic year. Now, of course, you know, the uncertainty spreads into 2021. And of course, we are now back in the place where we have to think about the 2021 academic year. So that's something that we are now working on. So there were other kinds of partnerships, of course. I mean, there's also a partnership with we had deep concerns about the quality of teaching and learning during that period of intensive online learning. And so we we convened meetings with the Council for Higher Education, which is the accreditation body in South Africa, the quality control organization in South Africa, and jointly produced a kind of a set of guidelines for universities to follow in terms of quality and so on. Another major crisis was the issue around mental health. I mean, I think we discovered quite early on that mental health was going to be a really major issue for us. And so together with an organization called Higher Health, which was originally a University of South Africa structure, we put in place a kind of a solution which was an online counseling facility, and that became available to students to use. Now, that doesn't, of course, solve all the problems. I mean, but it was an approach to try and facilitate sort of the challenges around to facilitate dealing with challenges around mental health. And then the third major intervention in the area of teaching and learning was the idea of staff development, of trying to ensure that there was a national capacity for staff development, to try and ensure that staff who were for the first time sort of engaging in this online activity would develop the capacity to do so. By the way, not all universities simply went on to online. Many of them adopted multiple kind of pathways to the completion of the academic year. And for those students who were most vulnerable in terms of access, the universities, even in the darkest periods, brought those students back onto campus into the residences so that they could use the facilities on campus to complete the academic year. So, you know, I know I'm giving the impression that everything was like sorted, but it wasn't. You know, there were lots and lots of challenges. And of course, amongst the big challenges was the issue of resources. Just the fact that there were subsidy cuts, there were kind of funding, tuition fee was not being collected, and so on. So universities had to repurpose a lot of funding and so on. In the area of research and community engagement and so on, clearly one of the biggest challenges we had was the issue around access to laboratories, and that was clearly not an easy one to solve, except for the fact that there was some really interesting experiments with regard to the remote access to equipment and so on. Just 1 minute? Wow, thank you so much. Okay, so just to say that in the area of research, I'll make just two large points then. The one was that there was a significant repurposing of research energy and to deal with COVID-19. And that was really important because it really brought the capacity of our universities to bear on dealing with the pandemic. And secondly, the major challenge we faced was the issue around postgraduate funding, because postgraduate funding was now extended over longer periods of time, and that had a major set of consequences. In terms of fieldwork, what we did was, again, as a sector, we developed guidelines, carefully shaped guidelines to allow fieldwork to continue under very strict conditions. And that went on successfully, I think. There's a whole range of other things to say, Damtu, but I think I'll stop there. It's amazing how quickly 7 minutes pass. Thank you.
So when you get a chance to actually re-articulate some of these issues, for example, through some words which is common here, subsidy for some of our audience outside of South Africa, that's not really clear. So I would give you a chance to re-articulate some of these issues. Sure. Thank you very much, Amit, for that. Listen, what we did here was, okay, what is now, we heard about Africa. We really want to know also what's happening in other parts of the world. And I cannot think of a better person to actually share this perspective with us than Professor Varghese, who is a Vice Chancellor of the National University of Educational Planning and Admin in New Delhi. He holds a doctoral degree in economics and specializes in educational planning. He's a founding director of the Center for Policy Research in Higher Education, head of governance and management in education at the IIEP UNESCO. At IIEP, he was also the Secretary General responsible for the Secretariat of the International Working Group on Education, which is a network of funding agencies in education. He's also the chief editor of Journal for Educational Planning, and so forth and so forth. I will simply conclude by saying he has published more than 30 books and research reports and more than 200 research papers and articles in academic journals, educational planning, financing, and higher education. I warmly welcome Professor Varghese to give us a perspective. Varghese, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Damtio, for a very elaborate introduction. I feel privileged to be in the midst of such intellectual community. And thank you very much for this invitation. And I'm the last speaker, perhaps in this series. And you have already listened to most of the changes that you are talking about. But let me start by saying that my first challenge, or perhaps in many universities in India and in Asia, was not to close down the universities, how to keep the universities open. So I want to make a point of departure in the sense that, so for example, we had international participants and we cannot close down the hostels. And once the hostels are closed down, we did not know what to do. And when the hostels were closed down, the students did not know what to do because the transportation facilities were not available. Flights were not available. And you need to have this test, 48 hours test done, then make the booking and then go ahead. But it was very difficult. I should say that one of my biggest challenges as the Vice Chancellor and also many of my colleagues was how to keep the hostels open. Whereas the normal pattern and trend that we find in most universities was to close down the universities, close down the hostels, request the students to go. So I think as a Vice Chancellor and a head of a leader of an institution, this was my biggest challenge because I also had international programs. Damtio, you know that, we conduct international programs. Till the last participant left because it's COVID. And if somebody is affected by COVID, we did not know what to do with that person. There's no family. There's nobody can go and service, and it was a very, very tough situation that we had for the first 3 months. The second issue that is related to this is also because we had a large number of migrant laborers. I'm not talking about external coming from outside, from city to city. And all these migrant laborers were forced to leave their rented apartments. This totally disrupted the social conditions of teaching learning processes at the school level and at the college level because they had to accompany the parents and there was no possibility of online education to them or anything. They are on the move. I mean, no, there was no trains, there was no buses, everything was cancelled. There are instances you might have read on in the newspapers that, 300 kilometers people are walking, 250 kilometers people are walking, So this was a different type of scenario. Something that is not particularly specific to higher education, but it's also affecting higher education, but more schools or school education is that once the schools were closed, midday meals came to an end. And many children from the poorer families, because of lack of midday meals, were put into the lowest levels of poverty. So we are not thinking about education. They are thinking about their survival because in many working class families, this was one of the best ways for the child to get at least one good meal is during the lunchtime, once schools closed down. Similarly, we also have facilities for hostel and free food for many of the students belonging to the disadvantaged groups in higher education college. When the hostels closed, this was also a thing. What I mean to say is that, so the challenge for many of the vice chancellors like us and the registrars of the universities was to not to close down, but to find a route for the children, the students, the youth who are already living there rather than closing down it blindly and all of a sudden. This was not the case with many other places, So I wanted to highlight that. The second dimension, the challenge that we faced was that the transition from which all others said that, the challenge was that how do you keep the classrooms disrupted, but learning not disrupted? This was the challenge. And of course, people are talking about the transition to online learning. I should say that this was not an easy task, given the technological divide that the students are having, and a big country like with different levels of socio-economic background the students are coming from, it was not an easy task. So there are 2 or 3 dimensions that were essential for us. One, let me start with the teachers. It was not only the students. For us, it was also training teachers on online teaching. So for example, telling small things like that, when many of our teachers knew how to join a Zoom meeting, but they did not know how to organize a Zoom meeting for the students, for 30 students or 40 students, and taking on small things. So providing this technological device was very important. The second dimension was that it is the mobile technology which democratized the learning process during the COVID period. It is not the computer technology was a dividing force, whereas mobile technology was an integrating, uniting force. But in many households, there were only one mobile and the children did not have access, and papa or mama may be taking it out if they are working as laborers, etc. So the classes had to be readjusted. My papa will come back only at 6 o'clock in the evening. So the classes had to be, madam, to be done at that point of time. And assessment related to that, online assessment was also a big challenge for many of the teachers, because most of them had forced to do it on mobile phones rather than on computers. So it was creating this facilitating condition in a university, both for the teachers and for the students, was a big task as a institutional leader. So that I should say that. But if you're talking about the research, since you are giving me 7 minutes, let me try to cover all the items that you gave. If you're talking about research, the research which based on empirical studies was in a very difficult situation. And let me also make this into two different categories. Those who are having quantitative data to be collected, it was conducted online, different ways in which quantitative data could be collected. But those who are following qualitative research, they found it very difficult, because focus group discussions and many arrangements. And when you go for a focus group discussion, you cannot do it online. You have to watch and see the person who is speaking and other things. It was very difficult then. So research has taken a back seat. There is no doubt about that. It was not only funding, it was more of organizing. Research was very difficult. And secondly, you cannot go to the field because you cannot travel. And if you travel to one place, you are not sure of coming back, unless you go for the quarantine for 6 days, 7 days, 8 days, etc. So it was very difficult. So fieldwork stopped. Empirical research suffered the most. And of the empirical research, it was a qualitative research that suffered most than the other one. Several institutions put research fields. One thing good or bad about research is that, unlike teaching learning, it is not quantifiable or measurable. What is to be done today and what is to be done tomorrow. So what also happened is that this is a lethargy, or this is an inertia that picked up. As a result of that, the teachers felt that, okay, what I can postpone is my research, but what I cannot postpone is the teaching. Also because of the reason that the teaching become a more collective activity. And if you are not teaching, it is noticed. Because in a normal circumstances, the pre-COVID period, if you come to the class and teach, people may not be knowing, the students will be knowing. But here what has happened is that there is more centralized information process by which the university authorities will be coming to know that this class was not taken, that class was not taken, and is also automatically recorded. So this had an effect of a different nature. Then about the education budgets. If you are talking about the education budgets, and I should also say that one of the difficulties that many students faced was the language difficulty, because we could not depend upon the good lectures by the best lecturers abroad, who are native English speakers, especially, because the students will not be, they will be following English, but they will follow English only if you speak English the way I speak English, not the way that native English speakers speak English. So the most of the videos and other things which we could not use, because they cannot be used without the support of the teachers. And in terms of the education budget, I should say that there were cuts. It was more than the cuts, just a timely flow. As an institutional leader, the problem that you faced is that not salary cut, because I am coming from a public system, so there was no salary cut. But it was more difficult to get the money, get the budget, force the ministry, persuade the ministry to get the budget and give the salary on time, and also provide these technological devices to see that my faculty members or the faculty members in the universities are in a position to cope with the situation. That is the situation that I would like to share with you at this stage. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Varghese, for that perspective, actually a different perspective than we have had here in in Africa. The next presentation we'll be hearing would be from Professor Balai Kassa. He's a professor of agricultural economics, but more so he's an acting rector of the Pan-African University, one of the flagship initiatives of the African Union's Agenda 2063. He was a registrar, academic, and research vice president, and later became the president of Haramaya University, one of the oldest universities in Ethiopia. He had been the economic justice policy and research coordinator at Oxfam America, and so forth. I'll just summarize by saying he authored and co-authored over 130 journal articles, book chapters, books, research, and consultancy papers. He's a founding fellow of the Ethiopian Academy of Sciences and fellow of the African Scientific Institute. Professor Balai, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Prof. Damta, for the introduction and also for giving us the chance to share our lived experience at the Pan-African University. The Pan-African University is a university of the African Union. It's composed of 5 institutes, of which 4 have already been operationalized. So our students come from all member states, currently 54 out of 55 member states. So when the pandemic struck, the Pan-African University institutes were caught off guard. Initially, there was a short period of confusion. There was such a belief that the pandemic wouldn't last long and normal academic and research activities would resume quickly. But it quickly became apparent that we had been dealing with an abnormal and probably long-lasting situation for which we had to look for a lasting solution. We also learned how unprepared and helpless we were to deal with the situation. As time went by, the directors of the Pan-African University Institute started to figure out ways and means of ensuring continuity of the academic and research programs. In brief, we had to face the reality and learn the hard way. So what were the challenges? Not necessarily in order of importance, but I'm going to list some challenges. One important challenge was glaring difference in digital competence among students and lecturers. I know that some of the directors are in attendance, and if need be, they can elaborate more on that. So there was a need to provide training both to students and lecturers on digital platforms and tools. Above all, it was not easy to convince lecturers to shift from, face-to-face or physical learning to online teaching. One other important problem that we had was to have access to robust and cost-effective internet connection. In some of the institutes, that was not easy. Then, there was also lack of skilled manpower, especially, to make use of the learning management systems and also to monitor them. Above all, how would it be possible to ensure quality in teaching learning while the platform is an online platform? And we're not prepared to such a challenge at all. Then even choosing and coming up with an appropriate platform and tool to support online teaching was not easy at the very beginning. Moreover, appropriate solutions for lab and practical teaching, like simulation, was one other problem that we faced. But I know that Prof. Bawa made reference to it as a passing remark, but for us, the psychological support for students during the pandemic was an important issue. Students were panic-stricken and psychologically affected because they're, in a foreign country, far away from family members, and especially when they learned that some of their colleagues were tested positive, we had to really manage the situation. And that was one of the most important challenges that we had to deal with. Then, what did we do? Initially, like I said, of the 4 operationalized institutes, only one of them had an educational management information system, making use of the learning management system to facilitate its teaching and learning process, and also to manage its academic programs. But the other institutes, I can boldly say that we're not making use of those platforms. So initially, the directors of the institutes started, using different tools like Zoom, WhatsApp, Microsoft Teams, KNet in Kenya, and Google Meet to facilitate teaching and learning. Course contents were and reading materials were sent out to students by email, and some of them were uploaded on the websites of the institutes. Continuous assessment and assignments were delivered and submitted by email. Of all the programs, if I make reference to some of the specific, activities, internship was most affected because students are to go back to their countries of origin to do their internship. So because of the travel restrictions, that was the most affected activity because of the impossibility of conducting field work and collecting data because of travel restrictions. Research topics were also, adapted. In some of the institutes, especially those working in social sciences, we used to encourage students to focus more on quantitative research, but then we allowed them to work on qualitative research techniques.
1 minute.
Master thesis supervision and defense, it was less affected because especially students who are already on the field didn't have to necessarily meet with their supervisors face-to-face, and communications were, by email, and that was probably the least affected activity. Then administrative processes, had to shift suddenly to a virtual meeting using, meeting platforms, and the academic staff, student representatives, and students had to meet with their, supervisors as well as their instructors using the virtual platforms. So let me stop here, and I shall come back to the lessons learned in the second part of preparation. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Prof. Balai. I'll now be calling up Associate Professor Bezu Galai. He is a professor of epidemiology and psychiatry at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health and Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard Medical School. He also is teaching as a faculty member at the Center for Bioethics at Harvard Medical School and associate member of the Broad Institute of Institute of MIT and Harvard. He collaborates in research globally and work in Chile, Peru, Ethiopia, South Africa, Uganda, and many other countries. In addition to his research, he also served on leadership roles of several research, training, capacity building programs for more than 15 years. Bezu, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Professor Damto, for bringing us together, as well as for the excellent leadership that you provide through this organization. Before I start my sharing my responses to the questions, I think in his keynote remarks, His Excellency Professor Afwerk rightfully has made the need for cross-sectoral collaboration. And as I hear the distinguished speakers, I think we have a unique opportunity to bring together institutions in ways that address the needs of educational needs of young people in our beloved continent. So just going to the response to the questions, as I try to reflect, it's not lost on me that our experience at Harvard might be different, but I'll try to put the perspective in light of some of the common concerns that my colleagues working in the continent would face. As such, I'll try to focus my remarks on the teaching as well as on the research that haven't been highlighted by others. So on the teaching side, I think the first challenge for us has been different faculty activities, particularly research work and community service, were put in a back burner as we had to pivot to remote instructions required, that everybody's full attention and full time. People were willing to share with each other lessons learned at the beginning. Initially, we were all focused on reacting on the situation as we tried to change to remote learning. And our focus was to provide didactics to our students in the immediate months. And then we spent the summer months of last year, particularly during June through August, to more thoughtfully and purposefully adapt our teaching methodologies to a new remote learning. Instead of the rapid transition that we have made to our courses, we started to think about what are the ways that we can do in ways that enhance the teaching, as well as make this a new normal where our remote teaching can be adapted into future teaching activities. So that was one activity that we spent in the last year during the summer months. The other challenge is something that was alluded by other speakers as well. We were required to provide students with emotional and social support that were previously distributed across campus entities and by other professionals. Especially the mental health impact was a major one. Multiple studies, research studies coming out show that students in every educational setting have experienced some challenge with regards to their mental health and well-being during the pandemic. Many have lost their loved ones. People had to work or juggle multiple jobs, but also many have lost access to school-based.
Is it me or?
No, I can't hear him either, Dr.
It was him, not me, right?
We can't hear him either.
Can't hear him.
We can't hear you. Oh, he's gone. Okay, let's hope he's coming back.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you now. Carry on.
Okay. I guess I think the challenge with internet is global. Even in the States, we face the same challenge. I don't know where I stopped, but just multiple studies have shown us the impact, the mental health impact of the pandemic, particularly on students, and many have lost their loved ones and have lost access to school-based services and support. And like everything, as my colleague from South Africa mentioned, this is something that we see in public health. There are disparities that are associated with regards to an impact. Not everyone is affected at the same level. So there were members of racial ethnic minorities, and those with low socioeconomic status particularly affected the highest. So one of the things that we've done in our school is the day COVID was declared pandemic, we decided to put together a working group that puts a weekly forum, a webinar that brings different experts together to address the mental health impact of COVID. And this was really important because not only for the students, but also for the faculty members and for others who've been dealing with some of the consequences of COVID. Another thing that we have done at the school as well as at the medical school is we had to make amendments to our even grading systems to allow for pass-fail in addition to later grades to allow for the new normal. Another challenge that has been quite common for us is inclusion of our international students that make up a significant proportion of our student body. While travel restrictions were helpful to slow down the spread of the disease, they also left our international students in a tough situation. I had students from India, students from various places in the continent and in Korea who had to reverse their sleep schedules in order to attend classes due to different time zones. So we had to make some extra efforts in order to accommodate the needs of our students, particularly international students. and we had to reverse our schedules as well, some of them to make them happen very early in the morning. And I think the blessing in disguise has been the process of developing some of the content of the courses, particularly the online courses, require some collaborative effort between the faculty as well as the IT experts. There were new things that we had to learn around learning systems and sharing information. This went from the initial emergency remote teaching to using those experiences to improving our traditional teaching classroom didactics. We're hoping that those methodologies will be quite helpful. As I speak, Harvard and MIT just decided to launch to continue a partnership that they started with edX to even further expand that and to be able to reach many others who have not been included in the online teaching platform, which I think is opening up more doors of opportunities, but also allowing others to access educational materials in ways that haven't been included in the past. On the research side, as I mentioned, we had to put our research work on hold following the local guidelines. Many of our research operation and in the US as well as globally had to be halted. We had to close down laboratories. We had to put several data collection projects on hold and had to delay writing of grants and writing of papers on hold due to demands needed for online teaching. Most of our focus has been helping students to navigate the pandemic and continue to make progress with their dissertation as well as their thesis. This has resulted in one word that many of the panelists have described: uncertainty. Institutions like Harvard rely mostly on extramural funding, so that has led to continued funding uncertainty. And many researchers had to pivot their research focus to include some COVID-related questions. And like everything, if there is any silver lining, we all started to think about ways of doing our research data collection efforts in a different way, particularly remotely. My colleagues and I just submitted a multi-institution grant to NIH where we had to make a deliberate decision where we would do our participant recruitment online and remotely. Like everything else, COVID-19 has amplified, as I mentioned, existing disparities across institutions and researchers, particularly many of my colleagues in the continent. And the digital divide is a real challenge. And this disparity is true in education. Those pre-pandemic disparities are even further amplified. This is not limited to institutions like us. I would say that this is true to everyone. And I hope that the discussion that we are having for higher education should also include K through 12 education, because at the end of the day, those in institutions or those who have access to technology at an early stage are going to have the educational gains compared to the others in public universities, less funded and less ability to commence their education during the pandemic. And I'll be happy to share some of the lessons learned during the Q&A session that we have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Bizu. In light of time, what I'm going to do now is I would be asking all of you in the order in which we started, what lessons were learned for the future? We learned a lesson. You presented the scenario, of what happened in the last 18 months. Now we've learned a lot of lessons. We know that. Now, what kind of proposals would you put forward for the future? You don't even need 3 minutes here. You can just hit it with 2 minutes. Some of you don't need to repeat what the earlier speaker said. So with that, we can wrap it up, and then we can open the question for the Q&A. But before that, we'll be listening from Professor Ronald Bisasso on that in the topic there. So let me start with the first speaker, Mike. I'm sure you heard me very well. My issue is, we learned a lesson. What is the future? Going forward, Mike.
Damtu, I'm going to summarize this in maybe one sentence.
Fantastic.
This is to say that what we learned is that change is the only constant, and leaders who are going to transform are the ones who are going to be able to have their eyes on the ball, meaning to constantly manage change. If you like, I'll just say one or two words around that. We had, while we were celebrating 50 years of existence, someone came here and made a presentation and said that the function of education is one, to make us sure that we can understand and interpret change. Number two, that we can be able to harness change. And number three, that we can train for change. And number four, we can create a culture in which we can be able to, an intellectually engaging climate to deal with change. It seems like the epidemic just taught us that one lesson. And I noticed that those universities that had already begun implementing either infrastructure to deal with the change, already we were talking about the fourth industrial revolution, and they had already started changing. When this happened, they had something to fall back onto. I know a university in Kenya, for example, that never disrupted anything. They did not lay down, they did not send students home, they did not stop teaching and learning, they did not cut costs, their learning continued. And so in my view, leadership is that kind that will going to help us manage change. That's how I would summarize it.
Thank you. Thank you, Mike. As Ahmed is leaving us in the next 10 minutes, I would rather give him a chance to say a couple of words along those issues. Ahmed, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Damtu, and I'm really sorry, but I have to go to another meeting. Just 3 points from my side. The first one is the need for us to really use a social justice rubric in the way we think about our universities and the relationship with society. This has been fundamental to our challenge in South Africa. The second one is the idea of building shared services platforms, national shared services platforms that will serve all universities and all colleges. So for example, thinking about a national digital teaching and learning platform, which includes connectivity and so on. Now that's something I think which would be fundamental as we move into the future. And then the third one is really to focus much more attention on the issue of sustainability. And it's not just about financial sustainability, by the way, it's also about effectiveness, efficiencies, and so on. But focusing on long-term sustainability and not depending on on government to ensure our sustainability. I'll stop there. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ahmed. I appreciate that. You can quietly peel off as you wish. Greatly appreciated for your contribution. Ernest, I'll come back to you, Ernest, in the order in which we started. Ernest, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much. I will also be leaving soon. I mean, the important thing that we've learned basically is that technology is going to be even more influential in how we train, how we teach, and how we learn. Long before the pandemic, we always knew that the biggest change that has taken place in education around the world was the use of new technology, how to communicate with students and so on, and how to do research. That was always the biggest thing. What the pandemic has taught us is that future of education is going to come a lot faster than we anticipated. And so we've got to prepare for that future, a future in which technology is used appropriately to communicate with students, to communicate with faculty, to make teaching and learning more interactive.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Ernest, for that. In that order, I will be asking Christine if she has something to say, something which has not been said on the future. Christine.
Thank you very much, Prof. I think one of the take-home messages here is not every emergency or danger is something bad. I think COVID has come and brought nations together. Nations, universities, and institutions together. And therefore, what we need to learn from here is that we must build very strong collaboration networks, be it interministerial or institution, to try and garner support and solve our problems.
Thank you very much.
Excuse me?
Yes, okay, carry on. Just a quick points.
Yeah.
Which are not, these are already stated in terms of collaboration and something which has not been stated.
Yeah, Prof, another important thing is we will only navigate through this when we are able to use data to do projections in future. That seems to be lacking, and that will help us to model what the future would look like, because we have talked a lot about uncertainties. So I think that's very important for us.
Yes, thank you very much. I'm sorry I have to rush you, but I'm sure you understand why I'm doing that. Wenderson?
Very quickly to add to what has been said, in addition to rethinking the traditional ways of doing things, I think what COVID-19 has taught us is the need for better understanding, cooperation, and empathy, which should happen within institutions, within the academic community, within our institutions, between institutions and among institutions, between institutions and different stakeholders, including the government. Coming to the private higher education sector, specific to this, there is a need for continuous and fruitful dialogue between the private higher education institutions and relevant stakeholders, which should be aimed at maintaining the confidence that private higher education institutions need due to the various challenges that I have talked about. And finally, in terms of leadership, one critical lesson I would see is the need for long-term planning. I think we need to have compelling visions, the ability to recognize and adapt to changing circumstances, and the need for effective leadership, which can only give us some confidence about facing the future with all the challenges that we've been talking about. Thank you.
Thank you, Varghese. As I said, you don't have to repeat what is already stated. Learn the lessons learned and what the future holds.
Three things in 1 minute. One is that I realized that leadership is an influence, and this influence can be very effective to overcome the resistance to change of the faculty members. This was very clear. And the argument that is to be used is that there is no other alternative, PNI. The second one is that how do we prioritize activities in the crisis period, and how do we target which is the weakest one? One can make that activities very clearly. And the third one I feel is that it's a question of equalities and inequalities, how a leader will operate. I think Matthew effect is very prominent in the context of technological division and movement towards online learning. So how do we deal with the Matthew effect in education? And that is one lesson that as a leader I had to address.
Okay, have I missed anyone? I'm looking at my, oh yes, that would be Bella. Prof. Bella, do you have something?
Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you. Well, I think one important lesson we learned is that the future is digital, and teaching, learning, proposal presentation, and thesis defense can take place without necessarily meeting face-to-face. Let me clarify. We've drawn heavily from the way we managed the pandemic, and PAO being a residential, postgraduate university, we required all our students to be physically present in the institutes. But based on the experience we had while managing the pandemic, we designed a new master's program for government officials working for African countries on climate change, because climate change is an extremely important issue, where 2/3 of the time they will be following their studies online, and 1/3 of the time they will be physically there. So the advantage is that they will still be working for the government, they will still be employed, but they will have the possibility to pursue their further studies, master's degree. And this is a new development. We're going to start this program in Algeria, And based on the experience that we'll get from this new program, we might, scale it up to the other institutes. So this is one lesson we've drawn from the way we manage the pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you. In fact, you answered one of the questions that was in there along those lines. Thank you, Professor Balai. Bizu?
Yeah. I'll just mention one thing that hasn't been mentioned by others. One of the lessons that we've learned is many international scientific conferences were held virtually, which reduces the barriers of access for many scholars in sub-Saharan Africa. And one of the impediments for engaging early career researchers is inability to attend due to travel and related costs. So I think this should be a major lesson where future high-profile scientific conferences need to have a virtual component in their planning, and we all have the ability to demand that as they make their plans in the future. Thank you.
Excellent point. I greatly appreciate that last comment with implications for what you call developing countries. With that quick response, I'll open, Ronald will be giving us a perspective as stated in the program. I'm introducing quickly Ronald. He's an associate professor and dean of the East African School of Higher Education and Development at Makerere University. His research interests include, of course, that's why he's invited here, leadership and management, higher education, among many others, and social change, internationalization, capacity building, and so forth. He's a member of the steering group of the Worldwide Universities Network, a global challenge in higher education and research. Ronald, you have 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, you, and I salute you all distinguished members of the panel, and I thank you for presenting this about the early 1990 shape initiated by UNESCO, and we also see other actors like Association of the Neoliberal Challenges. And now we live in a time of the knowledge society and globalization being part of it. And the pandemic we are discussing tonight revolves around issues of globalization, issues of internationalization. It migrated and it has caught the entire world. Where is the conversation? Gentlemen, even as we talk about what we have listened to today,
we have Ronald, we have a problem listening to you.
Institutions Ronald, up. Now we prepare for
Ronald.
Can you hear me now?
Let's try, but you have been squeaky in the last 1 minute. Ronald, we can't hear you.
Yes, please. Can you hear me?
Try. Let's give you a try.
Can you hear me?
Try. Yes.
Hello.
Yes, we can hear you. Okay, now.
Yeah. Can you hear me now? Good.
Yeah.
So the whole spectrum for the future using the existing leadership. Key to this is that gone, and of course initiatives, pedagogical leadership in Africa where they train teachers. There are also initiatives on research and management, and respective institutions. For instance, the University of KwaZulu-Natal, institutions in Ethiopia, Uganda Management Institute, Makerere University, were all beneficiaries of leadership training support partners. Realign the programs that are available to ensure that we produce leaders of today and tomorrow to confront the effects of the pandemic and also project their institutions into a very uncertain and complex future. And these are some of the key points that I would like to raise, 2 or 3, and then I resume my seat. One, what we have seen from all these emerging perspectives is that we now see the importance of multi-level governance. And so the key question will be, are our leadership and management training programs paying attention to the concerns and requirements of multi-level governance? We see the national quality assurance and accreditation agencies coming up with new regulatory tools where institutions have got to respond. We see industry coming in to offer free data. Can we prepare our leaders within the institutions for this kind of dynamic? And this is where now the training programs become very critical. 2, we need to appreciate the multi-sectoral dimension as already alluded to. But as we appreciate that, how are all faculty ready to interface and work with all these different actors in terms of designing the curriculum, in terms of the delivery of the curriculum, in terms of assessment, because we are dealing with a new normal. And therefore, the leadership and management programs need to rethink the way how they are organized and the way how they are delivered. 3, I like the idea about the early career academics. As we speak now, Damtio and colleagues, early career academics are the highest number of staff hired in most of the African universities. And this demographic is not about to change. Why? For instance, in Makerere, when a professor retires, he's replaced by a lecturer or assistant lecturer. They no longer hire a full professor at first entry. And so that therefore means that we are going to require capacity development for this caliber of staff. And then last but not least, we should not also forget the trend around the gender, issues to do with age, issues to do with sex, issues to do with the disciplines. We need to engender everybody to feel that they belong in the institution so that we can move forward with all our developments. And we have variously argued with my colleagues that it's important that we strengthen units on the continent that are responsible for building capacities for leadership and management, where you have a clear program to strengthen these deliberately. Only then shall we sustainably build capacities for leaders of today and leaders of tomorrow. And this is borrowed from what has happened elsewhere. In the United States, for instance, it was because of massification and other issues that they developed these institutes of leadership. In Europe, when they wanted to come up with new tools for decision-making, and then the involvement of students in decision-making in the late 70s, they developed these institutes and programs specifically geared at the development of capacity.
Ronald, 1 minute.
Of leaders. Therefore, as I conclude, in terms of having to pay attention to excellence and at the same time remain relevant. It's true that we have done a great deal on several fronts, but we need to appreciate that and to carefully reflect on the fact that all members of faculty within institutions, all doctoral students within institutions should be introduced to something regarding leadership so that they can appreciate matters of excellence and relevance. Thank you very much, Damtu. I feel profoundly honored for having been invited to share my thoughts. Thank you very much, and thank you, audience.
Thank you very much, Ronald, for those insights, which I think speaks to the issues we are talking about. Without further ado, what I'm going to do is I will open up the floor for questions. And I will echoing the questions that were already on the Q&A. The first one is how to mitigate. I'm going to throw all the questions in the interest of time, so that you can pick and choose accordingly. So the first one is, how do you mitigate the mental health issues? This is a very broad question. I think we have tried to respond to that. I think Professor Ahmed Bawa indicated how institutions have gone around to address that issue. The second one was assessment on graduate education. Someone asked in terms of virtual assessments and defenses, if they exist. I think that was already responded to, but if someone wants to elaborate further, I will limit time, by the way. The other one is preparedness for future pandemic. How are we going to be prepared for future pandemic? And Ernest, there was a very specific question to you, if Ernest is still around with us. He is not, I don't see him, so I will pass that. Yeah, let me throw that at you. Another question was very specific to Wendosen. The comment made was that private higher education actually were much better prepared than public higher education institutions in Nigeria. So, that contrasts with your presentation from other countries, probably Ethiopia as well. Yeah, there was also a very interesting question here. Yeah, we navigate this the world of online and distance education, but what about academic integrity? I think that has become also a serious issue. I want one of you to reflect on that. So let me say that, yeah, who would like to jump in? You can raise your hands to answer to any of these questions. Wendosen, I see that you liked up yourself. Carry on. Please be concise and precise and respond according to the question. I think the question is clear.
Thank you, Francis, for sharing the Nigerian experience. As you have truly noted out, the difference between the types of private higher education institutions and what happens in one country as compared to another country is what explains your question. As you might possibly know, even within the African continent, the responses of private institutions in terms of those owned by religious institutions, NGOs with better resources, those which are semi-elite institutions with better resources, better access to technology, and those with limited resources and limited potential, which we usually call demand absorbing, small type of private higher education institutions, is completely different. So the Ethiopian private higher education sector happens to be dominated by, as I said earlier on, 98% of the private higher education institutions are quite small, under resources, and heavily dependent on student tuition and fees. This explains the major difference between what happened in Nigeria and in Ethiopia, I guess.
Thank you. Anyone else? Otherwise, I'll point a finger here. I will be asking Professor Belai along the lines of assessment. And can you just rather briefly state your experience in terms of the postgraduate defense in the context of virtual assessment? There was a question by Yamina, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you. I think the virtual assessment is nothing but, like a physical assessment where supervisors and also assessors meet together and students give their presentations, and after the jury will meet separately and deliberate on the outcomes of the defense. So we've been doing it since the pandemic struck. And for us, that doesn't compromise the quality. We follow strictly the rules. The assessment procedures are rigorous, and we don't think that we've been compromising on quality. And you know, more and more institutes are, you know, shifting to virtual assessment because I think the issue of cost was also raised by Dr. Buzu. You know, most of our instructors come from universities outside the host countries. Some instructors come from North America, others from Europe, and the majority of the instructors come from the African continent. So we're able to save on the tickets while ensuring that the quality is still maintained.
In the meantime, while you are still here, Professor Bala, I want you to say briefly about the academic integrity aspect of things. That was also in connection with assessment.
I'm sorry?
Academic integrity.
Well, you know, we don't compromise on, you know, the requirements. The assessment procedures are quite clear, and the members of the jury adhere to the assessment procedures, and we don't think that we're compromising on quality, except the fact that they don't meet the candidates face to face. And you know, in an environment where you have, you know, a reliable internet connectivity, the process is very smooth, and we don't have issues in that regard.
Great. So I just want to, unless other people want to intervene here, Mike, do I see your hands or? No. Okay. So in fact, I would like you to, there was Betty who said that there were capacity building, before I move on, by the way, Elizabeth or Pio, how much minutes, how many more minutes can I have going forward? You have to let me know.
Hi, Dantu. We have to let the interpreters go. Unfortunately, they're contractually bound, but you can continue on a little bit after that and wrap up. That's okay. So is it possible to wrap up in 5 minutes, or would you like more than that?
5-10, if that, I think we should be able to do that.
Okay, perfect. Great.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, I want to address all the, as much as possible of the questions. This is a very exciting team. So Betty was asking, there was a capacity building effort for staff, but that has not extended to students. Is that a scenario in your experience? I want you to jump in. Where is Mike? What's your experience? What do your IUCEA member institutions say around those issues, Mike?
Thank you very much, Damtu, and thanks, Betty. I think, first of all, I think in the institutions, we mentioned a little bit earlier that many institutions conducted both capacity building for staff and for students. It is true that in some institutions that may not necessarily have happened, but you realize that for students to be able to operate on the digital environment, they also needed to be equipped with the skills to do so. Our experience is that that has been happening. Now at IUCA here, we have not yet run a capacity building something for students, but we have done one for staff. Maybe that's where Betty is coming from. But I would like to say that that is an area that we need to look at. But very quickly, Damti, before you throw me away, the question of integrity, I just thought I would say one or two things. One of the things I liked about this pandemic thing is the fact that it built some confidence in the qualifications coming out of e-learning or online systems. Before, if you said I earned my PhD online or my master's, people would be kind of suspicious. Did you really get that qualification? But because now everybody sees that this can be done, we are building some kind of confidence into it. And the question of integrity, in my view, arises whether it is on face-to-face issues or online issues. So I'm quite happy about the fact that this pandemic has made us build more confidence on e-learning or qualifications coming out of e-learning. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Mike, that was an interesting intervention there. You know, there was a question around issues of international students and their mobility, but I think Professor Bisu's intervention was responds to that in terms of how students actually have to change their sleep schedules and all that. So that mobility, in terms of that physical mobility, has also moved on. I think there was a question on India, but I don't see Varghese anymore. I know he was he was driving home, but apparently he's not there. So what I'm going to do now is I'll simply I don't I don't even intend to conclude, but there was one question from Ntuli, Mtoko Ntuli, who says, I'd like to read it. Learning is a social process and is worried that this digitization of learning is likely to produce what he considers to be robots without social skills that are required by prospective employers. I'm very happy to say that this is my distinguished student who got his PhD last year. Does anyone want to dare respond to this question? And then I'll wrap it up in terms of the Q&A. Anyone want dare do that?
Let me just, I think, take a crack at that. I agree. I think it's a social process, but I think we're reimagining what that social process looks like. I think when we're advocating for enhancing our efforts in online delivery, we're trying to liberalize, we're trying to democratize the teaching process so that it's accessible for everyone. But we're not completely abandoning it. What we are advocating is for a hybrid type of learning where content and expertise could be brought on from other institutions. My colleague, Professor Belay, mentioned about the defense, for example. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't be able to travel during the last month, but I was able to supervise a PhD defense as an external advisor for Addis Ababa University, so what we're trying to say is, let's make learning available for everyone. Let's use the tools that we have to make it accessible as broadly as possible with social justice lens, but we're not completely abandoning the social element. We're trying to reimagine the teaching, the learning, so that students who are learning at Harvard are getting the same education, whether they are in Addis, in Accra, or elsewhere.
Thank you very much. Thank you for taking a crack at that. I'll simply concluding briefly. As noted, universities around the world face a multitude of challenges from multiple corners. And of course, this requires, as we found out, requires competent, able, well-informed leaders and managers. Then it is imperative, as we see, to develop and support different forms of training and capacity building efforts in leadership and management, both in ad hoc and systematic ways, as Ronald indicated. As noted earlier, the CESA Higher Education in Focus series is steered by AAU, and another initiative, the African Higher Education book series, steered by INHIA, is also supported through the Africa EU Partnership Scheme, coordinated by HAQUA 2 project. We have identified 5 thematic areas for the book series, and these are harmonization, quality assurance and accreditation, research and graduate education, private higher education, publishing and knowledge dissemination, curriculum, teaching and learning. We are still soliciting and screening researchers to participate in these studies, so you are welcome, any one of you or listeners here, to visit the website for more information. We at inhea.org, inhea.org. Once again, I really sincerely wish to extend my gratitude to all the presenters and their perspectives, and thank you very much, all of you, participants and most certainly presenters. Don't go yet. I'm handing over to our handlers. Elizabeth, back to you.
Okay, thank you, Damtu, for an excellent event, very enriching. Thank you, colleagues. Thank you, panelists. Very stimulating, lots of rich content. For that reason, we are going to be making the video available via the CESA in Focus website, for which participants registered for this activity today. It will also be cross-posted on the HACWA 2 website. There will be a short summary report from this event as well, and we will be presenting a synthesis of this event and others at the AAU General Conference next week. Please note that this is only the start of a discussion, and as Damtu has announced, we very much link this to the work of the CESA Higher Education Cluster, to the book series that he is coordinating, and also to further work we will be doing to help support the African Union and the CESA Higher Education Cluster to conceive a policy data unit for more longitudinal, structured, and coherent data on higher education developments in Africa. We thank you very much. It is a great pleasure, and wish you a very good afternoon or evening wherever you are, and look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. And goodbye, good day, good night.